Hello and welcome to the reading and reflection for Sunday the 27th of September. We'll dive straight in because we've got a lot to get through, but have a listen. Here's the reading first of all. It's Philippians chapter 2 and it's verses 3 to 11. Don't be selfish or ambitious. Don't try to impress others or make yourself look good. Instead, lower yourself and look up to others. Put yourself at their service. Don't look for what you can get, but look for what you can give. Your attitude should be the same as that of Jesus Christ. Even though he was divine, he didn't grab or grasp or grip onto equality with God. Instead, he emptied himself of all power and privilege. He took on the role of a servant, even becoming a slave. He was born like any other human being, and he shared in our limitations and our weaknesses. And then by his own choice, he went even further down, accepting not only death, but death by painful public execution. He died as a common criminal, crucified on a cross, the lowest of the low. Because of this, God raised him up and lifted him to the highest heights. God gave him the place of honor and the name over and above all other names, so that at the name of Jesus, every knee shall bow, from top to bottom, whether up in highest heaven, here below on earth, or deep down in the darkest depths below. And everyone shall say, Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. Here endeth the reading. Now, this is one of the most famous passages in the New Testament, but first a little bit of background. This is a short extract from a short letter by Paul. Paul is also called Saint Paul or the Apostle Paul, and Paul wrote this letter around about AD 60. Now, if we say Jesus was born in the year 0, and if we say that he was crucified and died and rose again from the dead in about the year AD 30 or 35, and it was shortly after that he then returned to heaven. So now we're in AD 60, so we're about 30 or 25 years after the events of Jesus' life on earth, and he of course has returned to heaven. And the church is a very young organization. It's a very new religion. People are learning and discovering about Jesus. They're hearing it for the first time, and there are still some people alive who would have actually seen him, heard him, known him in the flesh as a human being here on earth. So we're in about AD 60. If I'm looking out of the windows of the church, and we have Watling Street running alongside the church, a major Roman thoroughfare, a highway that the Romans built through across England. And the Romans were building Watling Street around about AD 60 when Paul was writing this letter. The letter is called Philippians because it's addressed to the church in Philippi. And Paul's letters are always named after the people that they are addressed to. They're named after the recipients because they're all by Paul, so we couldn't just call them Paul's letter. It's Paul's letters to the Philippians. So we call it Philippians. Philippi was a city in northeast Greece, very close to the Aegean coast. So from Philippi, you could look out and see the Aegean Sea. And if you kept looking out towards the east, you were looking out towards what's modern-day Turkey. So this is Paul's letter to the Philippians. And it starts off ordinary, normal. It starts off like many of Paul's letters. It's in prose, it's got some practical advice, it's got some theological insights. He's writing to the church to teach them, to encourage them, sometimes to give them a ticking off, but they form the basis of much of the New Testament. But suddenly, in this short letter, Paul bursts into song. That's to say, he stops writing prose and he starts writing poetry. And it happens just after we began our reading. It happens in verse 4 of chapter 2. So he's had chapter 1, prose. Chapter 2 begins in prose. And then suddenly, out of the blue, we're into poetry, we're into verse, we're into this amazing lyricism. People think, well, maybe this was the words to a hymn, to a song that was sung in churches, and that the people receiving this letter would have known these words, would have been, a tune would have come to mind when he quoted these lyrics. That seems unlikely because the words don't actually have much scansion or meter. It'd be very hard to fit them to music. It may be that these were prayers or liturgy used in the church, and again, they would have been familiar to the people receiving them from Paul. It may have been that Paul wrote this poem, this song, this verse. He may have written it previously and now be incorporating it into this letter, or possibly just the spur of the moment, spontaneous inspiration. He starts writing in verse, which is very unusual for Paul. He's not the kind of person you would really call a poet, and it just seems quite out of keeping with his character. So here we go. We'll look at three things. We'll look at the shape and the structure of this poem, and then we're going to look at two verbs that occur in it. First, the shape and structure. It's full of language to do with up and down, high and low. It starts off with Jesus in heaven, equal to God, but not claiming equality, not clinging to equality, but even in heaven, he is choosing to take a lower, lesser place. He's choosing to honour God the Father as greater and higher than he is, even though they are equal beings. So he's accepting, he's humbling himself in heaven. Then he humbles himself further. He comes down to earth as a human being. And of course, that's a big step down from being the divine creator spirit with all that freedom and glory and beauty and to be limited to time and space, and of course, to a flesh and blood physical body. And then he lowers himself further down again, accepting death, the common fate of all human beings, but not just any death, the death of crucifixion, a public, painful death, a slow and humiliating death. And then further down still, from death to hell, to the place of darkness and desolation. Down, 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 step by step, stage by stage. The lowest, the last, and the least of all human beings. And then, when he's reached rock bottom, God scoops him up, first back up to earth, where of course he's resurrected and he visits his disciples and he's seen and known, and then his ascension, his return to heaven. And when he returns to heaven, he doesn't seem to resume the same place he had before. He doesn't take up the same position. This time, instead of being, as it were, lower than God, making himself, accepting willingly, humbling himself to be below one to whom he is equal, it's almost as if Paul implies it's the other way around. Jesus has gone back to heaven, and now God, the Father, almost tips his hat, bows to Jesus, his son, who has undertaken this journey of redemption and healing to save the world and to reconcile all things to God. So Jesus ends up again back in heaven, equal to God, but this time instead of making himself lesser and lower, it's more almost as if God himself gives honour and glory and praise to Jesus. So it's a very interesting physical shape to the poem, and it tells us a lot about what Paul believed about Jesus and what the early church understood to be true. So we see that shape, that scope of Jesus' journey. Now we're going to look at the two verbs that occur in this poem. The first is the word harpagmon. Harpagmon. You do not need to know that. You do not need to remember that. I'm just putting it out there because that's the Greek word, and I've translated it into three English words: grab, grasp, and grip. Grab, grasp, and grip. Paul, early on in this poem, tells us that Jesus did not regard equality with God as something to be grabbed, grasped, gripped. He was equal to God, but he didn't hold on to it. He relinquished it, released it. He loosened his grip and he let go. The Greek word harpagmon means to snatch or to seize. It's the root word of the Greek word for hook or claw. It's where we get our modern word harpoon. When you harpoon a whale, it's a horrible thing. And there's an explosive charge that releases hooks or claws into the whale's body. So to snatch, to seize, to get your hooks or claws into something, to grab, grasp and grip hold of. Jesus does not do that when it comes to equality with God, even though it's his right, even though he's entitled to it, even though it's his very nature is to be one with God, to be on the same level as God, yet he releases and relinquishes it. Do we do that? Do we do that? No. We like to get our hooks and claws into things that we think will give us an advantage, into things that we want or like or desire. We grab, we grasp, and we grip onto these things. Power, privilege, prestige, possessions. And Paul is making this point, do not be like that. Be like Jesus. Be like Jesus. Jesus exercised his right not to exercise his rights. He chose not to. He freely and willingly accepts less than he is entitled to. But often we do not do that. If someone takes away our rights, well, we become indignant. And it's not even our rights that we're entitled to. We often want even more. We want more than we need, more than we require, more than the law allows. We desire continually to have more possessions, power, privilege, and prestige. But Jesus doesn't even accept what he has, as it were, by right, by nature. Jesus shows us another way. Jesus shows us another way, a better way. So we've looked, first of all, at the shape of this journey, the way that Jesus redeems and rescues the world. We've looked, secondly, at this verb to grasp, to grip, to grab, and how we should be less grasping, gripping, and grabbing. Don't get your hooks and claws out. Release, relinquish. But then there's this third and final point we want to make, which is our second verb, and that is to say that Paul tells us Jesus emptied himself. He emptied himself. I translated it as he emptied himself of all power and privilege. But that's me trying to explain it or add a gloss to it. Paul simply says he emptied himself. Now, emptied himself of what? What does that mean? I mean, there must have been something that he emptied. If you took a jug of water or wine and you emptied it, well, the jug is now empty, but the thing that was there has now gone, and we know what that thing is. You could imagine a room could be full of treasure, could be full of junk, but you empty the room and whatever was in there has gone. What did Jesus empty himself of? We don't really know, but we know that he made himself nothing. And perhaps that's a better English translation. He made himself nothing. He emptied himself. And again, Paul throws that out as a challenge to us. It's not enough just to refuse to grasp and grab and grip. It's not enough to stop holding on. Are we willing to empty ourselves, to let go and to lose that which we have? Instead of trying to gain more, Jesus willingly gave all he had, all he was and more, up to and including his own life. He gave in order to gain, but not to gain for himself. He gave in order to gain the world for God, and in order to gain God for the world. He gave, as it were, a gift to his Father and a gift to us, reconciling God and creation, divinity and humanity at his own expense. Jesus emptied himself of everything that we associate with God: power, authority, glory. He could not stop being God, but he relinquished the trappings of divinity. He laid aside his majesty, and then he laid down his life. And the question to us is, how willing are we to empty ourselves of ego and of agenda? St. Augustine said, God can only fill that which is empty. Amen.